after high school, you know, I immediately, after graduating from high school, I immediately started college. But something was not clicking there because I could not find the area where I said, this is where I belong.
Yo, what's going on, midlife men? It is Dev Styles coming at you with Mr. Marcus down in Brazil. And we got a hot show for you today. This is a video that I've been excited all day, really wanting to do because we were going back on our normal messages and talking about some different topics. And, we just kind of started brainstorming and came up with an idea of what would we say to ourselves if we could interview ourselves back into the era we're going to look at is when we were in our early 20s, in the mid, or shall I say in the early 90s or late 80s. So we're going back late 80s, early 90s, when we were in our early 20s. What would we say to ourselves? What kind of conversation would we have? What would we say you should look out for? You shouldn't look out for? You shouldn't spend time worrying about? You should try to do this. You should try to work on that. Basically, we are the OGs of today about to go talk to our old selves. When people ask you that question all the time in interviews, what would you say to your 23 or 25 year or 30-year-old self? That's really what we're doing today. And so, but here's how we're going to do it. We're going to do various shows, and starting out with this one, we're going to be working our way through. Credit goes out to Neely Fuller on the 9 areas of people activity. These are areas of life that we all engage in, and all of them, they work synergistically, and they are all influenced by outside factors tremendously. And so what we're going to look at, the first one is going to be economics. And so, Mark, I'm going to let you start out setting the stage here. And if we go back to that time period, late 80s, early 90s, and when I say to you, before I say economics, just set the table for what was your life like in general terms around that time, just to kind of give a backdrop of where we're going to end up going.
Wow. If we go back to the late 80s and early 90s, it's still pretty vividly clear for me because, I had a 40-hour job where I was doing 40, 45, sometimes 50 hours a week or whatever. And in my small world, that little money that I was earning, I thought I was doing something. It was like, we look at what was the minimum wage back then. We're looking at like what, 335, 350, 360.
Yeah. I think it was
and
335.
So then when I got another job and I moved up to like almost $7, I was like
balling.
I was almost like I was balling, right? I had a car, it was a used little car, and I thought I was doing well. The funny thing about looking back at that is that sometimes I wonder the difference between how Black people are raised to look at things and how white people do, right? Because in some ways, in many ways, we're still so far behind where they are. I look back at those times, and some of the white people that I knew, some of the white people that I would work with, they were already looking at advances that they wanted to make in their lives. There were guys that were going into fields of employment that I had never even heard of. And so here I'm looking at life like I'm making almost $7 an hour. I'm about to be making $7.50 and $8. By the time I get finished with this contract, I'm gonna be up to $12.50 or something like that. And I thought I was doing really good. And it was like, somebody was supposed to tell me like, dude, that ain't no money. It's like somebody's supposed to pull us to the side and tell us the real money that's out there and how we're supposed to go about trying to get after that real money. This, it's like I'm living at home. I got a little car. I'm hanging out with some women now, and I thought I was doing decent. And I just got kind of like in a comfort. Well, say that again.
Women. He didn't say a woman. He said women. Go ahead.
Yeah. I'm thinking I'm doing something, and somebody's supposed to tap you on the shoulder and say, no, this is just to get your feet in the game. This is not making it, and on top of that, it's like at that point, I'm still living at home. And I'm like, so I'm not seeing this money that I'm earning as something that I can live on. I'm looking at it as I'm living at the crib and I got this spending money. I got a car. I'm able to go out. I got a regular stream of income coming in. I thought I was doing good. But like I said, it's that conversation was missing as to this whole world that's out here that I wasn't really aware of. Yeah. That's where I was at that time.
Wow, man! You just when you said that, you already made some things jump to my mind. I have to say, I was definitely much of the same. Now, I was coming out of a white school, a white high school. So I had already started noticing as well that difference between what was going on in our neighborhood, how Black folks were living, and certainly how folks were living in the suburbs where I went to school at. And then, of course, even visiting my relatives who lived in nice suburban neighborhoods out in California. So watching them, I had already had a perspective of, at least I'll say, outside of our Black neighborhood, which now that I look back, a lot of Black kids didn't have. And so that on one end helped, but then on the downside, I was still in the rut of what was going on in my hood. Even though I was aware and I was around people who were doing, I'll say, greater things, or at least I'll say they were maturing, I was hood maturing. And I like how you said that, because my hood maturing was exactly what you noted. You know, I worked at a store that we both worked at that was the equivalent of a Walmart today. We'll just say that. It was that we just call it that grocery store life, that clerk life. And so same thing, man. I was making $3.85. Boy, I started out 50 cents higher than minimum wage. Look at that. I'm sorry. Let me get this correct. I rejected that job. Actually, I started at $5.25 because I had a chance to take the $3.85 job. I started at $5.25. And then, like you noted, over the years, my pay was steady going up. But I didn't realize the copper handcuffs that I was putting on myself. And so all through the early 90s, I really wasted a lot of it. Now, you did better than I did. You were working full time. I didn't even work full time. I worked part time all of those years. And same thing, I wrote down here, spending money. I thought I had some spending money, but my spending money left because I had a son. And so having a son at an early age as a teenager, once again, I still saw how other people were living, but I was living like folks in the hood, having babies out of wedlock, or shall I say, becoming a baby daddy. Also, that side of living in my parents' home, I wasn't thinking about how to move out. And worst of all, I wasn't thinking about how to go to college. I had given up on that dream. And I had really given up on that dream when I had a son, because then my closest friends, they went off and started going to college. And that, I mean, when I look back at that time in my life, man, I realized I truly did give up on my own dreams. It was like the guy I thought I was going to become. When I hit my late teens, early 20s, I realized this guy was I was like a doggone, former slave that had been released after the Civil War. I was just wandering. I didn't know what to do. And so that's that kind of that backdrop for me.
Dude, that was the perfect word that you just said. It was like, damn, because I hit that same period where I was drifting. I didn't know, I was wandering. I didn't know where I was going. It was like, after high school, I immediately, after graduating from high school, I immediately started college. But something was not clicking there because I could not find the area where I said, this is where I belong. In those first 4 years after high school, I tried to go to college like 2 or 3 times. First it was at a major university. Then I went to like a couple of community colleges, and I just bounced around trying, I got into like business management. I studied a little bit of marketing, and I wasn't feeling it. So by, let me say, the end of the 80s and tapping into the early 90s, I had already started and left the university life because I just didn't know the direction that I was going in. So this little job that I had is it kind of froze me in time for a minute there until I could find out where I was going. Now, after this event, in 94 when my father passed away, that's when it really hit me like, okay, where am I going? What direction am I going in? And that's when this transition really started happening with me, because, you know, I discovered this whole world of literature that was explaining things, that was filling in the blanks with the education that I got from, you know, from let's say middle school to high school, left me with a lot of questions. And some of those books that I was reading by that time was starting to fill in some of these blanks. So by that time, I was really ready to start exploring more information. And that's when we come into that, we're talking about closing out the 80s and moving into the early to mid 90s, where I started making that transition. So I'm definitely there with you. I was totally wandering at that point because I didn't have a direction.
Ironically, this is when we met at the same time period in our lives.
I'll never forget that day.
We're gonna talk about that in another
episode. We'll leave that for the sex and relationships discussion.
Right. But you know, folks, I think the one thing that I think both of us bring to the table in this conversation is, although we're over twice the age of what we're talking about then, we're going to take the role of being OGs, saying, come on here, young man, pull up a chair, let me talk to you for a minute. So we're going to go back and talk to our old selves in that time period. And the good part, and both of us were talking before I hit record, the good part is we were the type of dudes that, I'm going to say, because I did have some clashes with some older people, can't lie. But if I didn't like people just coming down on me immediately, because I already felt bad enough about myself, especially as we get to the mid 90s, I already felt like I was enough of a failure. And so there were times where I may have had relatives or some older folks just be like, boy, how come you're not in school? Or why aren't you in college? Or and I was just like, no, I don't want to go, you know, and I did, but I was mad at myself that I had passed up that opportunity. But if an old person came to me and really approached me correctly, at least in my interpretation of correctly, I know, because I've always loved talking to old folks. I love talking to older people. And so I would have listened. So I know some people may be watching this, be like, well, at the end of the day, y'all wouldn't have listened to nothing some OG would have told you anyway. That's not true. That's not true. No. Yeah, exactly. And so we are going to talk to our younger selves. And so, Mark, I'll start with you. Now let's focus in right on economics. If you had a chance, let's pull up that chair. You about to talk to your young self. What would you share and try to school your young self on about economics?